Let's focus on to this development. The aviation industry has suffered a serious setback over the past 3 years. The industry has seen senior staff leaving, workers being retrenched, and the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the sector. Let's speak more on this. We're joined by aviation expert, Guy Leitch. Guy, thank you very much for availing yourself on this Monday. How would you characterize the situation, and just how desperate is it?
Hi, Gugu. It's developing. It's not yet a crisis, particularly in South Africa, but some aspects of this aviation skill shortage are already hitting home, particularly in the United States, where we saw an airline unable to operate the whole of the last weekend simply because it didn't have sufficient pilots. But it's coming here too. The problems are already, in a sense, a perfect storm. Historically, we've seen the lack of training or of new intakes by SAA, and also on the technical side, SAA Technical, we've seen the South African Air Force not training up new pilots. So we're facing a huge pilot shortage once the airline industry starts returning to more normal, shall we say, pre-COVID levels. The airline industry is currently running at just over 50% of its normal levels, so there's still a fair amount of slack to take up. But the real problem right now is that a lot of this most experienced and senior pilots and avionics technicians and engineers and air traffic controllers took early retirement during COVID because the airline industry suffered enormously during the lockdown. Literally didn't fly at all. And those have been lost to the industry without a new intake of people coming in. And that's why we have a looming crisis.
And that's just it, right? So it's not a crisis yet. What would push us to get to a crisis levels? And what kind of intervention do you perceive, at least, is needed, or what suggestions can you put forth?
Well, government has traditionally, in fact, 20, 30 years ago, government even provided subsidies for pilot training. That's fallen away. But government needs to address not just the shortage of pilots, but in particular the shortage of technical skills. They need to right at an early stage, in a sense like sport development. You've got to inculcate a passion and excitement and an interest in the subject. For a lot of emerging communities in South Africa, aviation has just sort of been a career choice that they haven't really considered because they haven't been exposed to it. So we really need to get the message out there that aviation is available for everybody, and we need to be able to get literally cadet programs going to enable those who've got the necessary science and math skills to be able to get training as engineers or pilots, those who want to get into air traffic control to do that. Because if we don't start doing that now, we really will face an enormous skill shortage. And the problem we have, too, in South Africa is that we lose a lot of our best skilled people around the world. As the skills crisis hits around the world, so the other airlines, particularly in the Middle East and in China, have been making incredibly enticing offerings, salary package offerings, largely tax-free, to South African pilots and engineers to come and work over there. So not only are we not training our people, but we're losing them to the overseas markets as well.
Guy, you point out perhaps a lack of exposure. I do wonder how much the cost of actually doing this training is also a deterrent. It's not a cheap exercise.
It's a vastly expensive exercise to train pilots. So roughly, you could say at least in the order of 2 million rand to train up a pilot just to basic competence to be able to consider it for airline flying. Engineers are obviously a little bit cheaper, and we've seen, to give it credit, SAA has, up until 8 years ago, was trying hard to develop a cadet scheme, and it succeeded. In fact, a lot of the pilots who've just been promoted to captain now were originally SAA cadets in SAA. We've seen the Civil Aviation Authority just graduate 10 new candidates. So some of these state organizations and parastatals are trying hard to do this, but not nearly in the volumes necessary. We do need to see a massive effort made to make flying training and, in particular, apprenticeships a lot more accessible.
I do wonder, though, Guy, when we compare ourselves to what other airlines on the continent are doing, Ethiopian Airways, Rwandair, Kenya Airways, what lessons can we draw from what it is they're getting right, particularly Ethiopian Airways?
Ethiopians is always the case in point, as people say, why can't SAA be more like Ethiopian? There are a number of reasons. I think that the single most important reason is that although Ethiopian Airlines is a wholly owned, state-owned airline, the government has taken a strict hands-off approach to the management of the airline. So much so that even when there was a Marxist government in Ethiopia, they still didn't interfere with the airline. Here in South Africa, we've had the opposite position. The government has made it absolutely clear that it's continuing with SAA, shall we call it version 2, for the sake of its development agenda, for the sake of transformation, for the sake of operating unprofitable routes to develop the country's economic reach, for those sort of reasons. Now, that means that the airline won't ever really be profitable and won't ever have the reserve funds available on its balance sheet to engage in expensive programs like pilot and aviation technician development. These are some of the reasons. Obviously, there are other reasons why Ethiopian is more successful. One of the reasons is that it has an enormous geographical advantage in being in the northern hemisphere and almost ideally located as a hub, because these days airlines operate in the hub and spoke system, like a bicycle, a hub with spokes radiating outwards. And Ethiopia, or Addis Ababa, became a natural hub, as did, for instance, Dubai and the Middle Eastern areas and so on. So, and there are any number of other reasons as well. The airline has been properly managed, and it engaged in a proper expansion strategy with the best possible managers to move into cargo when it couldn't move people any longer during the lockdown. So it's grown its cargo operation enormously, whereas SAA has always gone very backwards in its cargo. It used to be a large cargo operator, and it just continuously lost out to the private cargo operators. So there are many, many reasons why SAA hasn't been able to keep up with Ethiopian, or even for that matter with Kenyan, which is also really struggling, and which they're now talking of getting into bed with this year. That probably will not be a good idea, in my opinion.
And that's just it, this Pan-African airline group, Kila Vuka. What do we need to know about it?
Well, the precedent is not good. SAA under Coleman Andrews really tried very hard to create a Pan-African airline with Uganda and Tanzania. At the time, we provided the aircraft, we provided the crew, we provided all those skills, and unfortunately it fell apart due to political infighting amongst the various countries. I'm not optimistic that this will be any better, simply because Kenya Airways, as I mentioned, is already in extremely dire financial straits. It's looking at a $500 million bailout. That's call it 6 or 7 billion rand. That is huge money again. And it has many of the same sort of problems as SAA has, despite having the same geographical advantage. So it's going to be rather like two cripples trying to run a race, rather than actually being able to unite. And let me just point out that the race is extremely difficult. It's been very difficult for Africa as a continent to liberalize its skies. You may have heard of the Yamoussoukro Declaration and Decision, and then the solemn undertakings, and then the African open sky market. These are all more talk shop or hot air or false fake promises. We're not really seeing in the United States of Africa emerging, which would make it possible to have these sort of airline alliances work. I'm not optimistic about this.
Oh, Guy, you break my heart. Thank you very much, though, for availing yourself this afternoon. Guy Leitch, aviation expert.